Well, an official hello, my friends. Good evening. Good to see some people on here tonight. Some old faithfuls and a couple of new people that, well, Giver for one, or Gibur, the mighty one, is here tonight. And he and I have been going back and forth in emails for quite some time. And I'm glad to see you here. So tonight, I want to talk about Paul's one romance. Speculation, but there are many dots here in regards to Paul's journey into the world of marriage. Many dots, and we have to try to connect those dots because that's all we have are dots concerning him. It's astounding that a person that is so famous from the New Testament has no biography and very little autobiography. So we have to go to some pretty obscure sources to learn anything about him that is in fact ancient. That is ancient. Like that cute little fact of the marble box in Tarsus in Paul's house, stuck in the foundation. When taken out, find a pair of shoes and a manuscript, the Apocalypse of Paul. I don't know if you've read that manuscript or not. Probably some have, but it seems unlikely that Paul wrote that. So we wonder, were these Paul's shoes? Was this actually Paul's house? We never know those things because we have no notation on them at all. All we can do is pick out the little bit we have and connect dots. And that's what I'm going to do tonight, the best way I can. So I'm going to my notes. And we begin with prayer. In the name of the Father and the Son, Amen. That is Paul's reason for going after the Nazareans. Nazarene or Nazarene is a synonym with Essene. They're both the same thing, I'm convinced, along with a lot of scholars, convinced that they're the same thing. And when we read in the Acts of the Apostles that a lot of the priests became believers, would those be Sadducee priests? I certainly don't think so. They would be the dispossessed Zadokite priests, dispossessed from temple duty since about 175 BC. So we start with Jerome, Hieronymus. Jerome died at 420 AD, so you get a kind of an idea when he lived. That was the end of his life. Jerome was a translator of Hebrew. He tells us a lot of wonderful things about the Nazarenes. Some of them actually survive. We still have his essay on the Nazarene commentaries, which have to do with the two-house theory from the point of the ancient Nazarenes. And it is said by him that he translated the Gospel of the Hebrews, but his translation is nowhere to be found. Very sad. The Gospel of the Nazareans may be the same thing as the Gospel of the Ebionites. All we have are a couple of quotes left from it. So if you buy the book, the Gospel of the Ebionites or the Gospel of the Nazareans or the Gospel of the Hebrews, they're all the same. You won't get much in that book, maybe about 5 quotations. So Jerome corrected an error in the biography of Saul of Tarsus. He insisted that Saul was not born in Turkey. He was not born in Tarsus, but that he was born in Galilee. specifically in a place called Giscala, which is famous for having the rebel John of Giscala as a resident. Today, that place is called Gush Halav. Gush Halav. Or even more modern is the name Jish. 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 Let me show you where it is. This is a small picture, but you might be able to see it. Maybe I can make it a little bigger. All right. Zoom always pops up a bunch of stuff. And now I can't get to that because Zoom pops something up here. It says that if you touch the Alt key, the Zoom hints will go away. And believe it or not, they actually did that time. Oh, I'm sorry, it takes so long. You see, Jish or Yish is clear up here in the north of Israel. And it's just near the border here of the Golan Heights, where there's still a lot of trouble, where if you visit the Golan Heights today, you'll still see all kinds of tanks up there and barbed wire and barriers from the wars of 67, and I think the other one was 73. This is disputed property that just a few years ago, Israel incorporated. But a lot of maps don't like the fact that Israel incorporated the Golan Heights. So maps still show this being Syrian or disputed property. And here's Jish right on the border here. Way up there. Now I've got to try to get this back where it was. Okay. So that's where Jerome tells us that Paul was actually born. And Jerome is not a liar like some other ones. I think that we can feel quite certain that Jerome is telling the truth. He lived there in Palestine. He lived among the Nazarene. He was a translator of the Aramaic of that day. And I think he knows the truth on this. He should have known, since he worked and studied for many years there. And as I said, a translator of Hebrew and Aramaic manuscripts to Latin. So it's theorized that some kind of pogrom against Jews or a war forced his and many other families in that area out of the area. And I'm thinking if he was a Herodian, as I think we pretty well proved already, that it could have been Jews after Jews at that time, or maybe because he was an Idumean. I don't know. That's just speculation. But the family and many other families went running out of that area to settle in Tarsus, in Anatolia, or today's Turkey, in the east side, that Saul called his hometown and where we suppose he was educated. There were famous schools in Tarsus, and certainly with his boasting, he went to one of those schools and got a very good Greek education. As you can see in his writings, he quotes Greek philosophers at least 13 times. And one of them in particular, Seneca, we're going to look at next time, but we have a set of letters between Paul and Seneca that I believe, again, are authentic and that describe the situation of those who followed Paul at that time. Now we go to Epiphanius. He died about 403, a little later. He says that according to the Ebionites, he is the author of the famed Panarion, or the medicine chest of heresies, which you can look up in copies on the internet right now. That's Panarion. In that medicine chest, he describes about 122 different sects of Jews and tells us what they were called. And he gives us a little bit of the doctrine of each one. And one of the sects there in the medicine chest is the Ebionites. Now, who were the Ebionites? Well, they might have been the first apostles. Ebion, of course, means the poor. We see that in Acts and other places, the people of Elohim are called the poor. The Ebionites believed that Yeshua was completely natural, that he was the son of Mary and Joseph, that he was in no part divinity, but that he was brought here with a mission by Elohim to redact the law of Moses for his day and correct some of the errors in it. And that's pretty much what we see in the New Testament. He is, in a way, calling himself the new Moses when he says, "You've heard it said before, this, but I say." So he comes to correct the Torah of Moses. And this is what the Ebionites believed, that was his duty, his calling. The Ebionites also didn't really believe in supernatural happenings. They believed that you could not be saved unless you were a vegetarian. And in respect to the Nazarenes, the Ebionites were not Nazarenes. Nazarenes went along with the early Christian church, such as it was, in every respect, according to Epiphanius, except they kept the Torah. So that's why Epiphanius, in his Panarion, tells us that the Nazarenes were a cult. They were a sect. He says they believe just like us, except they keep the accursed law of Moses, which we call the Torah. So I'm thinking that Saul's purpose for moving to Jerusalem was to further his success. This is what's recorded in the Ebionites, in the Ebionite doctrines that Epiphanius collected and quoted. Saul's purpose, says the Ebionites, was to move to Jerusalem and further his personal success by marrying the daughter of the high priest. And that high priest in that day was a man named Caiaphas. Caiaphas. We know about Caiaphas because he's in the New Testament. He's the one that said that, what did he say about Yeshua? It's best that one person die for the nation. Caiaphas ruled a long time, from 18 AD to 36. He was the son-in-law of another high priest mentioned in the New Testament, that is Annas. It's said that Annas had 5 sons after him that had the high priesthood. There was actually 4 sons, and then there was Caiaphas, who was married to his daughter. He was a son-in-law of Annas, who must have lived an awful long time. If the speculation that Saul was a Herodian is true, then his family had the right stuff to marry a royal in Jerusalem. He had what he needed. Herodian, Roman citizenship, came from a wealthy family, must have to live there. And Paul had a kind of an example to follow. His sister, Cypros married the temple treasurer, an extremely rich man from an extremely rich family. The temple treasury was an inherited office. One family had it for many years. The one that Cypros was married to, named Helcius ben Alexis. Hold on a minute. There's something crawling around in my hair. We're getting off course here a little bit because we're going to talk about his son, or her son for a while, Saul's nephew, who you remember from the Acts of the Apostles, was named Julius Archelaus. You have a Roman name, Julius, and you have a Herodian name, Archelaus. Josephus writes about Julius Archelaus, stating that he was well-versed in the Greek learning, and he was the first to purchase a copy of the Jewish War, the account written by Josephus, and that he was one of Josephus' friends. And that he had Roman citizenship is evidenced by his given name, Julius. You didn't call your child Julius or Julius unless they were Romans to start out with. And again, the Herodian name of royalty, Archelaus. Saul thought he might continue this family tradition by marrying the daughter of the high priest. And again, that high priest probably was Caiaphas, maybe his successor, whose name was Jonathan ben Annas, Caiaphas' brother-in-law. Caiaphas' ossuary was found in a family tomb in 1990. Yes, I'm off course here, but it's important to tell the story. I would like to show you that if you've never seen it before. This is the Caiaphas ossuary, specifically Joseph Caiaphas. Can you see it now? We were speculating before coming on here about the value of this ossuary. An ossuary is a bone box. The Jewish people laid a person out in a tomb on a table for up to 70 days, and whatever was left of them, they put in a bone box like this, put it back in a niche in the tomb, and there it stayed perpetually. But most of the niches you find that have an ossuary in them, I'm sorry, but the ossuaries, if they have a name on them, it's pretty much scribbled on. Maybe you've heard of the Jesus family tomb. I talked about that a couple of months ago here. And we have the family of Yeshua in that tomb with bone boxes with scribblings on the bone boxes that tell who is in each bone box. And they are scribblings. You can barely read them. Consider what this ossuary might have cost in that day. And this is just one side of it, found in 1990. So now you know what an ossuary is. If you want to know more about the Jesus family tomb, look it up at youtube1.org. That's our site. I thoroughly cover that in several different presentations. In 2011, in that same tomb was found another ossuary. This was engraved with the title, quote, Miriam, daughter of Yeshua, son of Caiaphas, priest of Maaziah from Beit Imri. That is a real long inscription. what we do get from that is that here was a relative of Caiaphas, probably his granddaughter, or maybe his daughter, not sure. But this ossuary had been rummaged, but it may have held the remains of the princess that Saul eventually intended to marry. Let's go on to Acts 9:9. But Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Master, went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues of Damascus, so that if he found any belonging to the way, men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. Why was he getting letters for Damascus and not Jerusalem? Damascus was the place where the Nazarenes, the Ebionites, were able to thrive without persecution. Their home assembly was in Damascus. And then in another part of Syria, known as Antioch, was another assembly that had been either started or ruled by Paul and Barnabas. So you have at least two ancient assemblies there, one in Damascus that was full of Ebionites and Nazarenes, and then one in Antioch that was full of Pauline Christians. If Paul or Saul found any belonging to the way, well, we're spared what the punishment might be. But we know what the punishment was for a lot of these: crucifixion, thrown off of the parapet of the temple, buried alive, or beat with clubs until dead. That Saul was murderous is illustrated in the Nazarene Acts. And I have read this many times, but it's appropriate now to read it again. In the Nazarene Acts, and I believe that's book 1, chapter 20. If you don't have one of these, I can send you one via email. He began to raise a tumult. That is Saul. And it's happened to be, the setting was at the temple on the steps, while James was speaking in a prayer meeting among his group right there. And then the name of this particular section of the Nazarene Acts we find also in the Church Fathers. It's called the Ascents of James. That is the going up of the steps for James' meeting. But Saul began to raise a tumult so that the people might not be able to hear what was said. Therefore, he began to drive all into confusion with shouting and to undo what had been arranged with much labor. See, they were going to have a baptism. And at the same time, to reproach the Kohanim. James was one of the Kohanim. He was a priest. And to enrage them with revilings and abuse, and like a madman, to excite everyone to murder, saying, "What are you doing? Why do you hesitate? Oh, you sluggish and inert. Why do we not lay hands upon them and pull all these fellows to pieces?" You might recall in the last time we were together, I talked about Paul being a secret agent for the general, what was his name, Helcius, who was the first to get into Jerusalem of the Roman army, and also for King Agrippa II. Paul was a messenger man. He actually was sent to Greece to meet with Nero and explain to Nero why the Roman war against Jerusalem was not going so good. We don't have anything that says whether he actually went or not, but Josephus makes that claim very clearly, that Paul was a messenger for these higher ups, that is, the king and the general. So when he had said this, when he had raised the tumult, to continue the quote, he first, seizing a strong brand from the altar, set the example of smiting. He began to swing that brand around, which I think would be a piece of metal or bronze, maybe iron. And the thing would have been heavy. I think of it as a poker. If you've got a fireplace in your house, then you have some tools to work on that fire. And a poker is one of those tools, and it's just a small brand. Continuing, then others also, seeing him, were carried away with like readiness. Everybody was ready to go. I have in past sessions talked about Paul's gang or Saul's gang with his brother Custobarus and other of the family of the Herods that were bent on destruction, theft, and murder. This again is reported in Josephus in both the Antiquities and his Wars of the Jews. Back to the quote. Then ensued a tumult on either side of the beating and the beaten. Much blood is shed. There is a confused flight, in the midst of which that enemy attacked Yaakov, James, that is James the Just, brother of Yahshua and the leader of the movement at that time. And he threw him headlong from the top of the steps, supposing him to be dead. And so James the Just is left at the bottom of the steps, left as dead. What really happened to him, though, I'm sure he had a heck of a hangover from that kind of beating, but his legs were damaged. And this may be the reason why he was described by other early writers that he had the knees of camels. Why? Because he was so often praying for the sins of Israel. So that may be a manifestation of his beating. That's the kind of unconverted and unbridled man we're speaking of at this point in his life. Even the axe that protects him most of the time tells us how murderous he was. So he went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues of Damascus. That, with what Josephus says about Saul, his brother, their gang, getting away with criminal acts on account of their connection to and their kinship with the Herods, our speculation today need not be too far-fetched. Suppose, for instance, we consider Saul making a deal with Caiaphas. He writes a letter of introduction from Tarsus. He travels down to Jerusalem to Caiaphas. He has an offer for Caiaphas. Obviously, Caiaphas had known something about his reputation. Your Majesty, he might have said, you have a great problem with James and these Nazarene troublemakers. If you will promise Miriam to me, I will in turn get rid of these troublemakers for good. You've heard my reputation and you know my family. Now, if you will give me leave to rid this land of these vermin with a document or license to kill my gang, and I will take care of your problem. Then when we do, you will fetch Miriam to me and tie the knot of marriage yourself. That's not a quote from ancient literature. That's a quote from speculation. But this makes perfect sense, especially considering Saul's sister Cypros, that she was already down there in Jerusalem, living a high life with the richest man in the whole country. the temple treasure. Yes, it all makes perfect sense to me, considering the dots we are connecting regarding the life of Saul of Tarsus. Perhaps you know about Tarsus. I want to show you where it is on a map, or not Tarsus, but Cyprus. If I can get this map big enough to do it. Cyprus has always been in trouble, always been war going on there between Turkey and Greece. For that island, here it is, and still is being disputed. Here's Lebanon. Lebanon, the West Bank of Israel over here. See, in these maps, it is still cut out by itself and still thought of as being disputed, even though Israel had annexed that and up here in the Golan Heights, and Trump had moved his own embassy to Jerusalem, which is half in the West Bank and half out. Jordan, Syria, the home of the two assemblies, and here's Cyprus, that was the home of Barnabas, the original home. He was a Cypriot. Pretty big island right there in the Mediterranean. I gotta get this back again. I don't have a Heisen here tonight helping me out, so it takes me a while.
Paul was tenacious before his conversion, and he was tenacious afterwards. Like we talked about, he's kind of a bit of a sociopath, actually.
Yeah. Well, it seems like all these sessions here, there are pointers to who he was, and maybe write off some descriptions of who he was that seem to fly in the face of what we think about Paul, because Paul is the author of Christianity, without a doubt. All the scholars today say that same thing. And without much help, it's very easy to see how he deviated from the Jesus of the Gospels in many ways, and that he never knew Jesus, but he could have learned from James and the apostles what Jesus was really like. But he says that his gospel was not from any man. No man had informed him. I think that's in Galatians 1. When he knew James and Peter, at least, should he not have found out a little bit what they knew? But he says no. He says, no, this is my gospel, my gospel. You read in John chapter 17, a high priestly prayer, that Joshua prayed that all might be as one. But now there are clearly two gospels. I'm not going to make a judgment whether Paul's gospel is heretical or not. I'm just making a point that it is very different. And well, yesterday, Monday night, I made my point on this, the differences between the two gospels, the gospel of Jesus, the gospel of Paul. And you can listen to that if you like. It's online now at youtube1.com, I think. Sean was there too. We all were there. We decided to talk about what we thought about Paul and his doctrine. Surprising thing. We all had a different opinion. But at the same time, we're all in the Yahad. We're all in the same group. Somebody talked about how these people that hate Paul seem to be filled with hate. You get on that subject with them, they'll never let you go. They have some horrendous things to say, probably indicative of their personality, and maybe even of a demonic oppression of some kind. But still, we in the Yahad, we get together fine. We love each other, pray together, talk to each other every day. Oh, my friend, this is something you need to look for. If you're looking for fellowship and can't find anywhere you are, or if you're looking for right doctrine, again, I'm not taking a position on this. I'm only giving you what I have found. Why isn't the church telling these things? Why? I mean, why aren't the historians? Am I the only one, Sean? And you? Are we the only ones that know this stuff? No. But let me tell you, it's pretty hard to find any information on these things online or in books. All right, I'll get back to it. So Saul is thinking that he might continue the family tradition here. Talked about in 2011, in that same tomb, we found Miriam, and I read part of Acts 9. And I read about tear those fellows to pieces. And I told you we might suppose that Saul made a deal with Caiaphas, and we saw Cypros. So, yeah. Acts 9 continues, and here's some excerpts. They went down to Seleucia. That's east. Seleucia was the remnant of a very large empire. They're a great enemy of Rome. The Seleucus Empire, a remnant of the lands of Alexander the Great. And from there, we sailed to Cyprus, and they arrived at Salamis. Whoever is writing this now is the historian in Acts, the one that went along with Paul on his travels, because he uses the pronoun we, especially if you go from chapter 17 and on. All the rest of that is we. And the speculation is there's either a we source, a source written by somebody that went along with them, or there's some other information, a reference of some kind that we don't have anymore. But even historians understand 17 and on in Acts to be as historically true as possible. As for the first 16 chapters, who knows? They sailed for Cyprus. They arrived in Salamis. That's still the capital today. By the way, as I mentioned, Barnabas was with that group, and somebody else. John was with that group. John was a full-fledged apostle. He'd been with Joshua for at least 3 years. He knew what was right and what's wrong in the sight of Joshua. Verse 6, when they had gone through the whole land as far as Paphos, they came upon a certain magician, a Jewish false prophet named Bar Jesus. That is Jesus' son. Very, very curious. And the next verse makes it even more curious. He was with the proconsul, Sergius Paulus. Sergius Paulus is a historical personage. 2 memorial stones have been found in Cyprus with his name on them. And one says that he was the proconsul, one high up in government. And so this historical man is found to be with Bar Jesus, who has another name too. But Acts tells us that Paulus, Sergius Paulus, was a man of intelligence who summoned Barnabas and Saul and sought to hear the word of Elohim. Verse 8, but Elymas. Now, that is another name for Bar Jesus. I tell you about names, pseudonyms, nicknames, surnames in the Bible. They all mean something. And we can learn a lot about those Bible characters, because I think most of those names in the Bible, especially the New Testament, are surnames, names given to a person that describes what they're like. You know, like Peter. Peter was not his name. That's his surname. His name was Shimon Bar Yonah. But now you're Peter, or Yeshua would have said, Kepha, stone. You're a stone. You're a rock. And on this foundation, this stone, I will build my ecclesia. Same with Barnabas. Acts tells us that Barnabas means son of encouragement. But as usual, it's like the author of Acts does not know Aramaic, because Barnabas doesn't mean son of encouragement at all. You can look up and see what it really means. Yet we continue to look at that and uncritically. Several others as well. And what the last presentation I wanted to do with this series was to do nicknames and surnames and learn about the disciples, the real story. So Sergius Paulus summoned Barnabas and Shaul and sought to hear the word of Elohim. But Elymas, the magician, or the Magi, M-A-G-I, for that is the meaning of his name. It is? Here's another one. Elymas means nothing like that. Magician. We'll speculate a little more as to what this man's name means and what he was there for. But Elymas opposed them, seeking to turn the proconsul away from the faith. Evidently, the proconsul was already thinking of this, had some introduction. But Saul, 9, who was also called Paul, how did Saul become known as Paul? Have you ever asked that question? Have you ever heard it given to somebody to answer? I've seen it on Quorum several times. Quora, the answer plays. But Saul, who was called Paul. Oh, I'm going to speculate on that in a second. Looked intently at him, that is Elymas, Bar Jesus, and said, "You son of the devil, you enemy of all righteousness, full of all deceit and villainy, will you not stop making crooked the straight paths of the master?" Wow, this quote sounds an awful lot like the writer of Acts talking about Paul at the beginning of chapter 9. Do I have to remind you of what that is? It sounds like the same kind of voice here. And here's Paul using all the vitriol of his persona from before his purported conversion, using the same kind of terms against Elymas than he did against the Nazarenes. Now, I wanted to decode this verse, these verses, verse 9, for a long time. When I say decode, I'm talking about decoding in the sense of the New Testament code. The book, one of the books by Robert Eisenman, who we were talking about at the beginning of this before we actually started out. So much to be learned with Eisenman's method. And he also wrote James, the brother of Jesus, and the New Testament Code, many other ones, to explain the Dead Sea Scrolls and to explain the names of the New Testament and what really happened behind the writings. Now, Robert Eisenman is a friend of mine. We have done lectures together in the past. He's getting elderly now. If you go out to our YouTube site, you'll find that we have at least a half dozen and probably more like a dozen of interviews with him where he tells us all kinds of things. And in one particular interview we did for 2 hours, he started to tell us personal things, which he has a policy of not before. But anyway, if you never heard of him, he's a member of the Ahad, at least the think tank. He knows about us and he gives us his blessing, but he is a Zionist Jew. He's not a believer in Jesus. He says that if there was a Messiah, it would be James the Just. Now, he might not be righteous, but then again, the teacher of righteousness might not have been righteous either. He was a teacher of righteousness, as we explained at the beginning. He's teaching something that he doesn't necessarily keep or believe himself. That's what all teachers do. If you go to teach, you teach the subject. You don't teach your opinions. You don't teach your religious opinions. Eisenman is Jewish, and he does keep the feasts, and he has to because his wife makes him do it, and the Sabbath. I asked him about Sabbath keeping. He says, I keep the Sabbath, but I don't go into any synagogue. And I said to him, why not? He says with a smile and a little chuckle, what does the rabbi have to teach me? And that's true. But a lot of us here, we recognize his brilliance in the method he teaches, and we admire him. We admire his teaching and his opinion. He's also one I can tell you right out. He says about Saul, who'd want to be with a guy like that? They're just such understatements that they're funny. All right, back to the decoding. Sergius Paulus, I was surprised to find, was indeed a historical person, proconsul under the Emperor Claudius. And Claudius ruled from 41 to 54 when his wife killed him, 54, and made her son the new emperor, that was Nero. These are boundary stones. There's a boundary stone of Sergius Paulus found in 1887. It records the appointment in AD 47 of the curators of the bank and the channel of the river, Tiber, in Italy, one of whom was Sergius Paulus. Another inscription was discovered in 1910, at Soli on Cyprus by Luigi Palma di Cesnola, which mentioned again the proconsul Paulus. This inscription was dated to the middle of the 1st century. these inscriptions and the person, Sergius Paulus, is in the right time that Paul would have been starting off his tour, not very long after the resurrection of Yeshua. So if Sergius Paulus is historical, let's also assume that the Magus, Elymas, was also historical. And then right after meeting Paulus and Bar Jesus, Saul changes his name to Paul. And all we know is that Paul, who was also called Saul, looked intently at Elymas. I'll speculate one more time and then we're done. I would speculate, especially since John was the real apostle of Yeshua, that he might have suggested to Saul, hey man, you really need a new name. Everybody's scared of you because they know your name. Now, here we got your first convert, the proconsul, a bigwig, Sergius Paulus. Paulus was his first name. Would it not be wise to take the name of your first and most famous convert and use it in place of Saulos? Why else would people begin to call Saulos Paulos? If these people begin to call you, say, Paul, then your reputation probably won't be following you anymore. I think probably Sergius Paulus and Elymas had heard about Paul's works before and were probably scared to death. But the situation I just described seems to make perfect sense to me. I don't think the writer of Acts knew how that happened. So he takes a shortcut and he just pops over it. And then for the rest of the time, he's called Paul, which means little. What does Shaul mean? I don't know, but I know Sheol, spelled exactly the same way, is a place like hell, an abyss. And in Hebrew, if you write the name Shaul, it's spelled exactly like the place where people went for torments, Sheol. That would be a second reason why he might want to be called something else. Now, look, if my name or your name was Jeffrey Dahmer, wouldn't we feel we had to change it? Attached to our name, anytime it was spoken, would be the reputation of a murdering pervert. Yes, I would change mine. I couldn't be saddled with a name that brings to mind horrible crimes. And I think Saulos Paulus did the same things. When I started out with the YouTube, let me see, about 12 years ago, I started a YouTube ministry. I had started a website ministry back in the 90s. And you can still see a gob of my horrible self-built web pages out there here and there. But I was thinking, and it came to my mind, what name I should use for this YouTube channel. And by the way, I'm going to change it here pretty quick. I got a new name. But I felt that I was being spoken to by a Holy Spirit. And what that Spirit seemed to say to me, okay, I'll just go right with it. What that Spirit said to me is, what's wrong with your name? Do you have a horrid reputation? Have you been running with the gang, murdering, and so forth? No, you've been a church guy all your life. You've had a few little knockoffs with the police and so forth, but is your name good? I said, well, I thought about it a couple of days. I said, yeah, I think it's good. Use your own name. That's the only thing you really, really have. You're stuck with it no matter what, unless you change it. And so it became Jackson Snyder Presents after Hitchcock Presents. Alfred Hitchcock had the show on, it's still on today, where he would present a half hour of some kind of, sometimes creepy, sometimes wise types of shows that you would learn something from, or maybe be a little bit frightened. And his logo was a silhouette of his head, a side view of his portrait. You know what I'm talking about. This was a show when I was a kid from the 50s, somewhere in the 50s. I watched this every time it was on. I liked it. And so when I started, I used the same music that was on there, the funeral march of a marionette. I'm not thinking of who wrote that right now, but that's how the music I used behind my introduction at first. So if my name was Dahmer or something else, I would have to change it, wouldn't you? Unless you wanted to go live in a hole in the ground someplace. So I think Saulus Paulus did the same thing, and I don't know much more about that. But if I find something, I'm going to deconstruct it a little bit and find out why. As far as Elymas, and I'll end with this. As I mentioned before, this name doesn't mean magician in any language. I've looked at a lot of languages with this, but you would think that Elymas would be from Aramaic. I think Elymas was a Samaritan. The closest I can get to a translation of what I see as a nickname from Aramaic is Eli, E-L-I. Who wrote the Acts isn't good with names. E-L-I is my Elohim, or my El, possessive. Mas can mean a couple of things. Mas or Mar, look, he has to put an S on the end of this because that is good Greek grammar. Okay, so Mar could be Mas here because whoever wrote this one wrote in very good Greek. Mar means master, or it's also equivalent to the sacred name Yahweh, Maria. So if that's right, the name could mean my God is my master, or I am the master of my God, or Yahweh is my God. Mas also means to lay down or to be forced into labor. And in the future, I'll try to decode that. What became of Paul's romance? Evidently nothing. You notice in the authentic words of Paul, which some of the books in the New Testament are not his, but the authentic works, I should say the inauthentic works, has him as pretty much a woman hater. A woman hater. You know, there was a split of the Southern Baptist Church here recently. And part of the reason was that one part of it thought that women ought to teach men. Well, what's wrong with that? I don't allow a woman to teach, says pseudo-Paul, from one of the letters that is pretty well proven not to be authentic with Paul. But then he has, like in Romans, he names a woman as an apostle with a capital A. several other places like Junia, he speaks of as an apostle or a minister. And the Southern Baptist Church takes a split over a saying supposed to be from Paul, but probably isn't. Now, come on. Paul has to defend himself for being a liar all the time. Look up the word lie or liar in the Pauline passages of the New Testament. He's always defending himself. I'm not lying. I'm not a liar. Liars go to hell, he says in one book. So I forgot what I was talking about. Tell me. Oh, well, yeah. We don't know about his romance. He never says a word about it, but he seems to denigrate women in a big way. And some of 1 Corinthians seem to be inane. You know, why does a woman have to keep a hat on her head? So back in 2009, my wife and I went to the headquarters of a big name Hebrew roots evangelist. Well, actually almost an Elymas himself. And we sat in the audience while he was giving a little sermon on the role of women. And he pointed out my wife because she did not wear the required headdress, which I think it's utterly ridiculous that Paul would say this. Oh, I don't really know. I'm thinking because of the angels. Okay, he passes that off. He doesn't give us a real reason. What would the angels have to do with that? Well, you could think of a few things, but I don't think that that is authentic to Paul, and most people don't. My wife got upset. Did she start crying? No, this is mignon. She got up on her feet and she said, oh, do you consider that birdhouse on your wife's head to be proper head covering? Yeah, the Rebbetzin had a birdhouse on her head. I'm not kidding. A little birdhouse propped up on the top of her bun or whatever it was. Amazing. One time I took a new proselyte to the Assembly of Yahweh meeting in Tampa. And they had invited us to come because they wanted to talk us about doctrine and stuff. And I took over a new proselyte, a woman that she just had gotten into this. She knew nothing about head coverings, except that, no, I don't, when I was a pastor, I didn't approve of them. I thought it was ridiculous. But we went in there, and the guy, the head of the Assembly of Yahweh, said right off the bat, we can't start yet. Why not? That woman doesn't have a proper head covering. And already there had been a couple of the women in the congregation that bringing her over a little doily or something to put on. And she refused to do that. I don't blame her. What if they brought a little doily over to me to put on my head? So after two of them came, they came over to me, and Commander Lee was there. And they said, you're going to have to take her outside. Just go out there for a minute, put this doily on your head. They called it covering. Put this on your head, then you can come back in. Or you can just leave her outside. And of course, we said, no, we brought this person 3 hours here to this meeting because you had requested it. And we don't believe in that like you do. So we're all going to leave. And we did. And we went instead, taking that 3-hour drive to Perkins restaurant and had some pie. All right, I'm finished. Let's take a look if there's anything in the chat. I'm sorry, I'm a little bit scattered today. Vicky fell off her bed. I thought she lived in a tent. Let's see if there's anything here. My sister's name is Dormer, says Vicky. And my dad said to her, weren't you married to that Jeffrey Dormer guy? Well, if your name was something like that, someone's bound to ask you if you're some relation. What do you have? Mini 14.
Yeah, but he said it was no big deal. Like in passing, like, oh, by the way, weren't you married to that Jeffrey Dahmer guy?
Well, you should have broken in and gave that. That was very good. Let's see.
Brother
Let me just
Finney
ask
asked a
a question.
question.
Yeah, you ask a question, then I want to ask everybody one. What do you got?
Go ahead, Brother Finney. Brother Finney had a question.
Oh, good. Is he gone? No, he must have a bad connection tonight.
Yeah, he might.
Well, what happened yesterday, I'm still worn out from it. We had to go down to immigration to get Charlie's fingerprints made in West Palm Beach, in a very obscure place. Why can't they get fingerprints in your town? Everybody takes fingerprints here, sheriffs, police, all that. No, you have to make a tedious drive through terrible traffic to get down there at the rush hour and do this. And when I just spent $1,600 to get my air conditioner fixed, and I went out yesterday morning, turned the car on, no air conditioner. What choice did we have but to get in that car? It was over 90 degrees yesterday here. In the car, it was probably 105, and drove down there all that time, waited around there, and finally got home. Well, we went out about 9:30, got home about 4:30. And my shirt, of course, and clothes were soaking wet because I sweat. I sweat when it gets over 70. And I was worn out. I jumped into the shower, made it as cold as I could. I really felt a couple of times like I was going to pass out, and took a shower and I went to bed. And I slept for several hours. And then today, I slept till 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And I'm still a little combobulated with that. So that's why I'm a little off tonight.
Brother Finney wanted to know, Brother Jackson, he wanted to know what the definition of Paul was. He says Barnabas means son of encouragement, and Peter, son of Galicia, I think it means.
Neither one of them are right.
What about Paul, Brother
Paul means little guy, small guy. Saul, of course, was supposedly a great big guy. And so his name becomes small guy, just the opposite of what he had before. I've never read Paul in Greek literature as meaning small, but where did I get that from? Did I get that from Paul himself in his letters? Seems like it. If you look it up in a lexicon, you probably won't find that definition. You might.
He says that he is less than the least of all saints.
Yeah, there you go.
In his writings.
The least, the smallest, littlest, like James the Less. That doesn't mean he's any less than anybody else. That could mean James the youngest, or James the second. Could mean either one of those things. All right, was there anything else? Now, was he a little person? movies about him, or the older movies, back from the great Hollywood era, where he shows up like Quo Vadis. He's a small guy with an almost malformed nose. Got to be fake nose, and bald, except around the side. He's like a 60s hippie, only now in the 21st century. You see a lot of them, they're bald on the head, but they leave the hair on the back of their head real long and make a ponytail out of it. Like you, Sean. An old hippie. Anything else?
Hey, I'm getting a haircut soon. My wife told me I had to get a haircut, so.
Okay, all right. See, that's why you have a hat on.
Yeah, that's right.
Oh, you saw a movie that he was young and good looking. Well, yeah, these later movies, they are making him handsome and strong and tall. But unfortunately, we don't know. We don't know. We have no idea. We do have the first portrait of Paul. I've seen it, but I don't know where it is. So you can see why he never married. Why? Do you think that beautiful women don't love ugly men?
I think all women don't like murderers.
Oh, well, I'm an ugly man, and I've had 3 wives. Death, I'm a widower, and all my wives have been very beautiful and smart. It doesn't make any difference what you look like. It's how you approach the whole situation that makes the difference.
How you approach the murder?
You don't approach it like that. Yeah. And, maybe Paul wasn't a murderer when he came down.
I'm sorry,
married.
Jack.
That's
You just
okay.
have me rolling tonight. I'm so sorry.
All
I
right.
don't live in a tent anymore. I live in a cabin. So
That's
I have a
great.
bed. And I did fall off when you told the story about the bird nest.
Well, I imagine that somebody on here knows who that is, but I'm not going to say who.
No, I don't want to.
She didn't say anything. The Rebetson never said a word about it. But I was proud of Mignon, very proud that she would get up, because before I got a hold of her, she couldn't even read in front of people. But we just kept working with her and putting her in the church liturgy and getting her to read stuff. And she lost her shyness or shame, whatever it was. So,
Brother Jackson, did you read chat? You should read the last message Steve posted.
no, what is it?
I didn't really want to read it out loud.
You don't?
No, you read it and then you decide.
Let me look at it. Recent, this is Steve. Recent procedure. Yeah, I can. You're talking about surgery. You're talking about this thing and this one down here. Yeah, I'll be glad to tell you about that in short. Here we go. I had a pacemaker and defibrillator put in several years ago. It's over here. It's like a box here. It's under the skin. There's a wire going from that box to the heart. If the heart stops, then it puts out about 50,000 volts to start that heart again. And sometimes these things go awry and they just hit. I've known some people where the thing it went awry and it just started shocking him to pieces. And 50,000 volts hitting your heart, I mean, that's got to be painful. So defibrillator, what's the other thing? It's a pacemaker. If my pulse gets too low, it'll hit the heart and get it to speed up a little bit. Battery operated. Every such and such a time, they have to surgically remove that again and put a new battery in. On this side, I was looking at Facebook about a month ago, actually, And if you look there, about everywhere you find an advertisement, it's an old man sitting in a reclining chair. All right. He gets in that chair and all the air goes out of him. He becomes just shriveled up like a corpse. And then they talk about the procedure, barostim, barostim. And it shows the guy coming up out of the chair and blowing all up again. All right, I read that commercial. I kind of like the illustration. I read all about it. It seemed to be addressing exactly what my problem is, and that is a low blood pressure. Every time I get up, every time I do anything that is a little bit strenuous, my blood pressure drops down to nothing. And when that happens, you feel completely weak. You feel like you're going to pass out. You can't see. Your eyes are blinded because your blood pressure is so low. And blood is not flowing to your brain at all. So this barostim purports to do this. The device itself is a shock generator. And it's put over on this side, down here in the chest. So I got a box here each side. And they run a wire, not to the heart. They run it up here to the carotid artery. Look how close they cut and didn't cut the artery. Your dog? Okay. They hook that wire onto a nerve, a pack of nerves on that carotid artery. The pack of nerves go down to the heart. And somehow, I don't know how, but when you do something strenuous, like getting up like this, just put me down. Not to mention laying down in bed and trying to get up. My bed's on the floor. I like it that way, but trying to get up is very strenuous for me. And this has been going on for a long time. So when somehow this thing knows, I guess when your blood pressure drops, and starts shooting that nerve up there in the carotid with electricity, which goes down to the heart and makes that thing speed up, makes it work harder. See, my problem with my heart, in 99, I had a 5-way bypass. Doctor had given me 2 weeks to live. The 5-way bypass was great for about a year. And then I began to take advantage of medical understanding of the modern age and began to get stents. That is things that open up titanium, little tubes that open up arteries. And so I lost count at 21 stents, including in my legs, hips, aorta, heart, vessels, all over the place. And it getting to the point where you can't put a stent in anymore. There's just too many of them. And if I get another lesion in one of these arteries, chances are they won't be able to reach it again. What am I going to do? Well, I will eventually die. In fact, I've been waiting to die for all these years. But Yahweh has not allowed the devil to do that. Or maybe the devil's keeping me alive. So when I get up now, my heart starts beating, and the faintness either diminishes some or just isn't there. It's a miracle. I can get up as many times as I want. I can walk. I couldn't walk 20 feet. And I go from the car into my apartment. I go about 3 feet and I have to get a hold of something or I'm going to fall down. That's why Trelly would walk alongside me. I can get a hold of her and stand there for 2 or 3 minutes while my blood pressure equalizes. That's no good, especially when you're walking across a railroad track. Yeah, that is for sure. Praise Yah, Baruch Hashem, Yahweh. You're a blessing too, Steve, the strong man, the bold man. Yeah, your wife, I'd like to talk to her sometime. I would really like to talk to her. We'll make an appointment sometime soon. Amen. Thank you for coming out tonight and hanging in here while I'm stuttering around. And we'll be back on probably Thursday, unless I'm not feeling well. Okay? Thank you. Love you very much.